People laughed when Martha Ellis carried her mattress down into the root cellar and said she'd be sleeping underground from now on. But months later, when the worst blizzard Red Willow had ever seen swallowed the town whole and tore the warmth out of every home above ground, those same voices would fall silent as they realized her strange decision was the only thing that stood between life and freezing to death. Long before that storm ever touched the horizon, Martha had already made up her mind. Though no one understood why. Not in a place like Red Willow, North Dakota, where winters were harsh but familiar and folks prided themselves on knowing how to handle whatever the season threw at them. Because to them, preparation meant stacking firewood, sealing windows, checking generators, not turning a dirt-walled root cellar into a bedroom. Yet, that was exactly what Martha did. Quietly, and without asking for permission or approval, transforming the small underground space beneath her farmhouse into something far more deliberate than a storage room, reinforcing its wooden beams, lining the walls with thick insulation, sealing gaps where cold air might creep in, and installing a narrow but carefully designed ventilation pipe that allowed fresh air without letting heat escape. And while the rest of the house above remained modest and unchanged, it was down there, beneath the frost line, that she focused all her attention, as if she trusted the earth more than the walls she'd lived inside for decades. And people noticed. Of course they did, because in a town that small, nothing stayed private for long, especially not something as unusual as hauling a full bed, blankets, and supplies underground. And soon enough the comments started, first curious, then amused, and eventually dismissive, with neighbors stopping by under the pretense of checking in, only to glance toward the cellar doors with barely concealed smirks, asking questions they didn't really want answers to, like whether she was expecting some kind of disaster or planning to hide from the world. And Martha would simply shrug, offering no long explanations, no arguments, just a calm, steady presence that somehow made people more uncomfortable than if she tried to justify herself. And at the center of the quiet ridicule was Dale Harper, her closest neighbor, a retired trucker who had seen more winters than most and believed strongly in doing things the right way, meaning the way everyone else did. Them, and to him, Martha's project wasn't just odd. It was unnecessary, even foolish, because in his mind, storms were something you waited out in your living room, not something you burrowed beneath. And he said as much more than once, laughing loudly at the diner, telling anyone who'd listened that Martha was turning herself into a groundhog, that next she'd start predicting the weather from down there, and the others would laugh too, because it was easier than considering that maybe, just maybe, she saw something they didn't. But Martha never reacted, never defended herself, never asked them to understand. She just kept working, day after day, as autumn crept closer and the air sharpened with the promise of another long winter. And if anyone had taken the time to look closer, not just at what she was doing, but why, they might have noticed the way she checked the weather reports more carefully than most, the way she reinforced not just the cellar but the access to it, making sure the door could still be opened even if snow piled high above it, the way she stocked it with more than just blankets, adding water containers, preserved food, extra fuel for a small, efficient heating source, and tools she hoped she wouldn't need, but prepared anyway. And they might have remembered, too, though few talked about it anymore, that Martha had lived through a storm years earlier that had nearly taken everything from her, a blizzard so fierce it had trapped her and her husband inside their home for days, cutting off power, cutting off heat, and slowly turning the place they trusted into a freezing box that no amount of blankets could warm, a storm that had left her husband weakened beyond recovery by the time help finally arrived. And while the town moved on, as towns tend to do, Martha never quite did, because she had learned something in those long, silent hours that no one else seemed to carry with them. That cold isn't just something you keep out. It's something that finds a way in, creeping through walls, seeping through glass, settling into the bones of a house until there's nowhere left to hide from it, unless you build somewhere it can't reach. And that was what she was doing now, not out of fear, but out of understanding, shaping a space that relied less on power, less on exposure, less on the fragile systems everyone else took for granted, and more on something constant, something older than any house in Red Willow, the steady, insulating embrace of the earth itself. And by the time the first frost settled across the fields and the sky turned that hard, pale gray that always meant winter was close. Martha's underground room was finished, simple but complete, a quiet refuge hidden beneath an ordinary farmhouse. And from the outside, nothing looked different enough to raise alarm. Just a pair of reinforced cellar doors set into the ground, easy to overlook if you didn't know what they led to. And life in town carried on as it always did, with people preparing in their usual ways, confident in routines that had worked for years, maybe even decades, never imagining that this winter would be any different, never suspecting that the thing they laughed at, the thing they dismissed as unnecessary and strange, would soon become the only reason some of them would make it through what was coming. Because far beyond Red Willow, out over the open plains, something was already beginning to take shape. A storm unlike the others, quiet at first, almost unnoticed, but growing stronger with every passing hour. And while no one in town felt it yet, Martha did, in the way she double-checked her supplies one last time, in the way she paused at the cellar door before stepping down into the space she had built for exactly this moment, not hoping to be right, but prepared in case she was. The storm didn't arrive the way storms usually did in Red Willow, with a steady build and plenty of warning. It crept in quietly, almost politely, as if it didn't want to be noticed, and that was exactly why no one took it seriously at first, because early that morning the sky was just a dull gray and the wind barely stirred. The kind of day where people finished chores without rushing and told themselves they had plenty of time before anything real hit. And even when the first snow began to fall, it came down light and powdery, nothing unusual for North Dakota in the heart of winter. So Dale Harper poured himself another cup of coffee, glanced out the window, and muttered that the forecast had probably exaggerated again, just like it always did. But by midday something changed, subtle at first, the way the wind began to rise. Not in gusts, but in a steady, growing force that pressed against the walls and rattled the eaves with a low, constant hum. And the snow thickened, no longer drifting gently but driving sideways, slicing across the open land in sheets so dense that fences vanished from view and the road beyond his property simply disappeared. And still, even then, people told themselves it would pass, that it always did, because that's what they believed about winter, that it was predictable, manageable, something you endured rather than feared. But this storm had no intention of following the rules they were used to, and by late afternoon the temperature dropped. Sharply, faster than it should have, the kind of drop that made the air feel brittle, like it might crack if you breathed too hard. And then, without warning, the power went out, not just in one house, not just on one line, but across the entire town in a sudden, complete silence that swallowed the hum of appliances and left only the sound of the wind. And at first Dale didn't worry, because he had a generator, same as plenty of others, and he'd tested it just weeks before. So he bundled up, stepped outside into the biting cold, and fought his way through the blowing snow to get it running. But the wind made everything harder, fingers stiffening within seconds, snow piling faster than he could brush it away. And when the generator finally sputtered to life, it did so unevenly, coughing and straining like it was already exhausted. And inside the house the heat returned, but weaker than before, less certain, like it might vanish again at any moment. And across Red Willow, the same fragile hope flickered in homes that depended entirely on power to keep the cold out. Because modern comfort had always come with an invisible condition, that it worked only as long as everything else did. And as the storm intensified, that condition began to fail, because the wind didn't just blow harder, it became relentless, a force that howled across the plains without pause, driving snow into every crack and corner, burying doors, sealing windows, pressing against walls with a weight that made even solid houses feel temporary. And the snowfall itself became overwhelming, piling up faster than anyone could clear it, turning open spaces into deep, shifting drifts that erased all sense of direction. And when night fell, it brought with it a darkness deeper than usual, because without power there were no lights to push it back, only the faint glow of candles and flashlights struggling against the vast, consuming black outside. And inside Dale's house, the temperature began to drop. Despite the generator's effort, the heat unable to keep up with the cold forcing its way in, seeping through the windows, through the floorboards, through every surface that connected the inside to the storm beyond. And he added layers, piled on blankets, tried to ignore the way his breath started to fog in the air. telling himself it was temporary, that the power would come back, that the storm would ease. But hours passed, and nothing improved. And then, sometime in the middle of the night, the generator failed completely, cutting off with a final, helpless sputter that left the house in total silence again. And this time there was no backup, no quick fix, just the cold rushing in to fill the space it left behind. And it wasn't just Dale. Throughout the town, the same thing was happening. Systems failing one after another, generators freezing or breaking under the strain, heating systems shutting down, pipes beginning to ice over, and homes that had always felt strong and safe suddenly revealing how exposed they really were, because they had been built for comfort, for light, for openness, not for a storm that refused to stop. And by the second day, the situation turned from difficult to dangerous. As temperatures inside homes dropped to levels that made staying still a risk, people huddling together, conserving energy, trying to hold on to warmth that slipped away no matter what they did. And outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, the wind continuing its relentless assault, the snow piling higher, the world beyond each front door becoming more unreachable by the hour, because stepping outside now wasn't just hard. It was nearly impossible, with visibility reduced to nothing and the cold biting so sharply it felt like it could tear through skin in minutes. And all the while, beneath the same storm, hidden just below the surface of the frozen ground, Martha Ellis sat in her root cellar, where the air remained still and the temperature steady, the thick earth around her blocking the wind entirely, the cold unable to penetrate the insulated space she had so carefully prepared. And while she could hear the distant muffled roar above, it felt removed, contained, like it belonged to another place entirely. And she listened, not with fear, but with a quiet, heavy understanding, because she knew what that kind of storm could do, had seen it before, felt it creeping through a house until there was nowhere left to escape it. And she also knew that above her, in the homes that looked stronger, bigger, more comfortable, people were beginning to realize something they had never had to face this way before, that the storm wasn't going to pass quickly, that help wasn't coming anytime soon, and that the things they relied on most had already begun to fail them. And as the second night settled in, colder and darker than the first, Red Willow fell into a silence that felt unnatural, not peaceful but heavy, as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. But nothing did, because the storm kept going, hour after hour, unbroken, until the line between night and day blurred and time itself seemed to slow. And in that long stretch of uncertainty, one truth began to take hold, even if no one said it out loud, that this wasn't just another winter storm they could ride out in their living rooms, that this was something else entirely, something that demanded more than routine preparation, more than confidence, something that exposed the difference between being ready and only thinking you were. And while most of Red Willow faced that realization in the dark, fighting to hold on to what little warmth they had left, Martha remained below, in the quiet, steady shelter she had built not for comfort, but for exactly this moment, knowing that when the storm finally ended, the real test wouldn't be how well it had been endured inside those failing homes above, but who was still strong enough to step outside and face what came after. By the time the storm finally loosened its grip on Red Willow, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like whatever came next would decide who actually made it through, because the silence that followed was worse than the wind, worse than the snow, worse than the endless dark, a heavy, suffocating stillness that settled over the town like something had been buried beneath it. And when Martha Ellis pushed against the cellar door from below, she felt the weight immediately, packed snow pressing down so tightly it barely gave, forcing her to brace her shoulder and shove harder, inch by inch, until a crack of pale light broke through and cold air spilled inside, sharp and biting, nothing like the steady warmth she had lived in for the past 2 days. And when she finally forced it open enough to climb out, what she saw stopped her for just a moment, because Red Willow was gone, not destroyed, not exactly, but erased beneath towering drifts that reshaped the land into something unfamiliar. Fences vanished, roads swallowed whole, roofs barely visible under layers of snow that reached halfway up their sides, and no movement anywhere, no sound of engines, no voices calling out, not even the distant rumble of plows, just that same unnatural quiet stretching in every direction. And Martha didn't waste time wondering how bad it was, because she already knew. She had heard the storm above her, felt its persistence, understood what that kind of cold and wind could do to a house, to a person. And she also knew one more thing that most of the town hadn't fully grasped yet. That surviving the storm itself was only half the battle, because what came after, when heat was gone and help couldn't reach you, that was where people were truly lost. So she moved quickly, layering up, tying a rope around her waist, grabbing a shovel and a small sled she had prepared long before winter began, and stepping out into snow that swallowed her legs almost to the knee. Each step heavy, deliberate, but steady, because she had planned for this too. And her first destination wasn't a guess, it was a certainty, because she knew exactly which house would fail first, not out of weakness, but because she understood how it had been built. And when she reached Dale Harper's place, it took time just to get inside, digging through drifted snow that had piled against the door like a wall, clearing enough space to force it open. And the moment she stepped inside, the cold hit her. Differently than outside. Deeper somehow, trapped, unmoving. And Dale was there, slumped in a chair, wrapped in blankets that no longer held any warmth, his breath faint, visible in the air. And for a second, he didn't even seem to recognize her. Just stared like he wasn't sure she was real. And then he managed a weak, dry laugh that didn't carry any humor at all. "Guess you picked the right place to sleep," he muttered, voice barely holding. And Martha didn't answer, because there was nothing to say, only something to do. So she knelt beside him, checked his condition with a quick, practiced look, and asked the only question that mattered, "Can you stand?" And he nodded slowly, though it looked like it took everything he had left just to do that. And getting him back wasn't easy, not even close, because the storm might have passed, but it had left behind a world that fought every step, snow shifting underfoot, wind still cutting through open spaces, cold biting harder now that there was no movement to mask it. And Dale stumbled more than once, leaning heavily on Martha, the rope between them keeping him from falling too far behind. And it took nearly an hour to cover a distance that normally would have taken minutes. But when they finally reached her place, and she pulled open the cellar door again, letting that hidden warmth rise up to meet them, Dale froze at the top of the steps, not from the cold this time, but from something else entirely, something like disbelief. Because everything he thought he understood about surviving winter didn't match what he was seeing. And when he stepped inside, the change was immediate, the air warmer, still, almost unreal after what they had just come through. And he just stood there for a moment, looking around at the small, solid space, the thick walls, the steady light, and shook his head slowly, like he was trying to make sense of it. But Martha didn't give him time to dwell on it, because she wasn't finished, not even close. And over the next day she went back out again and again, each trip harder than the last, because the cold drained energy faster than she could replace it. But she kept moving, guided by memory and instinct, checking the homes she knew, the people she had seen just days before going about their normal lives. And each time she found someone, the pattern repeated itself. Shock, relief, confusion, as they were led through the frozen silence and into the one place in Red Willow that still held steady against the cold. And soon the cellar was no longer just Martha's refuge. It became something else entirely, a shared space where strangers and neighbors sat side by side, wrapped in blankets, hands slowly warming, the reality of what had happened settling in piece by piece. Because outside, their homes had failed them, not completely, not forever, but enough to show a truth they hadn't wanted to consider, that the way they had always done things wasn't enough for what they had just faced. And when the rescue teams finally arrived days later, carving their way through blocked roads and buried paths, they came expecting the worst, expecting loss, expecting stories of people who hadn't made it through. But instead they found something different, something they didn't expect. A group of survivors gathered in a root cellar beneath a modest farmhouse, alive not because the storm had spared them, but because one person had prepared for something no one else believed would happen. And word spread quickly after that, not just about the storm, but about Martha Ellis, and the place she had built beneath her home. And in the weeks that followed, as Red Willow dug itself out and life slowly returned to something recognizable, the laughter that once followed her name disappeared, replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect. And Dale was the first to say it out loud, standing outside her house one cold morning, looking at the cellar doors that no longer seemed strange at all. "You weren't hiding down there," he said, voice steady now, no trace of the old certainty he used to carry. "You were ready." And Martha just nodded, because she hadn't done it for recognition or to prove anyone wrong. She had done it because she understood something the storm had made impossible to ignore, that when everything above ground can fail, when comfort turns fragile and the world becomes unpredictable, the difference between surviving and not isn't luck, it's preparation. And sometimes, the safest place isn't the one that looks the strongest from the outside, but the one built quietly, out of sight, designed not for ordinary days, but for the moment everything goes wrong.